The equation appeared on the board. Impossible. Unsolvable. 3 MIT professors had tried, failed. But Thomas, the man they called stupid, the janitor they mocked, Thomas walked to that board. And in 37 seconds, he changed everything. 6 hours earlier, Lincoln High School, room 204. Thomas Martinez pushed his mop bucket down the hallway. 43 years old, left leg twisted from birth, speech slightly slurred. The students, they saw disability. They saw weakness. They had no idea they were looking at genius. Every day, the same routine. Thomas would arrive at Lincoln High at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the first bell. He'd unlock room 204, the advanced mathematics classroom, and begin his cleaning ritual. But something was different about the way Thomas cleaned this particular room. While he mopped, he listened. While he dusted, he watched. Professor Johnson was explaining calculus to the senior honors class, writing complex equations across 3 blackboards. The students struggled with basic derivatives, but Thomas understood every symbol, every operation, every elegant proof. Today we're going to discuss something extraordinary, Professor Johnson announced, tapping his marker against the board. One of the 7 Millennium Prize problems. The Poincaré conjecture was solved in 2003, but 6 remain, each worth $1 million to whoever can prove or disprove them. The students perked up at the mention of money. Sarah Chen, the class valedictorian, raised her hand. Professor, has anyone from our school ever attempted these problems? Professor Johnson chuckled. Sarah, these problems have stumped the greatest mathematical minds for decades. They require PhD-level understanding of topology, number theory, and abstract algebra. That's when Thomas did something unusual. He stopped mopping. He stood perfectly still, listening intently, his weathered hands gripping the mop handle. In his shirt pocket, barely visible, was a small notebook. Battered, worn, pages brown with age. He'd carried it for 20 years. Look at him, whispered Jake Morrison, the quarterback. The janitor thinks he understands math. Several students snickered quietly, but Thomas didn't seem to notice. He was concentrating on something else entirely. As Professor Johnson wrote out a particularly complex equation, something strange happened. Thomas began moving his lips, almost imperceptibly. Numbers. He was whispering numbers under his breath. The sequence seemed random to anyone listening, but there was a pattern, a rhythm that matched the mathematical expressions on the board. What the students didn't know, what Professor Johnson couldn't see from his position at the front of the class, was that Thomas's mathematical handwriting was flawless. Despite his physical limitations, despite the tremor in his left hand, when Thomas held a pencil to solve an equation, his writing was precise, elegant, perfect. The bell rang. Students packed their bags, chattering about weekend plans and upcoming tests. As they filed out, several made comments they thought Thomas couldn't hear. Imagine if we could get the janitor to do our homework. He probably thinks 2 + 2 = chair. Poor guy. At least he has a job. Thomas continued mopping, but his movements had changed, more deliberate, more purposeful. Because what nobody knew, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that Thomas had been solving these problems for 20 years. In his head, every single day. Thomas Martinez hadn't always been a janitor. 23 years ago, he was Professor Martinez, youngest mathematics instructor ever hired at Caltech. Brilliant, passionate, destined for greatness. The accident happened on a Tuesday. A drunk driver ran a red light while Thomas was walking to his morning lecture. The impact shattered his left leg in 14 places, caused traumatic brain injury that affected his speech centers, and ended his career in 37 seconds. The same amount of time it would later take him to change the world. His colleagues visited him in the hospital once, maybe twice. When the insurance money ran out and Thomas couldn't return to teaching, they stopped visiting altogether. His fiancée, Rebecca, stayed for 6 months. I can't do this, she told him one evening, unable to look him in the eyes. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I just can't." His family tried to be supportive, but watching a genius reduced to slurred words and a limping gait was too painful. They gradually stopped calling, stopped visiting. Thomas understood. It's hard to watch someone you love become someone you don't recognize. But here's what none of them understood. The accident had damaged Thomas's body, damaged his ability to communicate clearly, but it had left his mathematical mind completely intact. If anything, the isolation had sharpened it. With no students to teach, no papers to publish, no conferences to attend, Thomas had nothing but time to think, to solve, to dream in equations. For 20 years, he'd worked as a janitor at 3 different schools: elementary, middle school, now high school. He'd listened to teachers explain concepts he'd mastered decades ago, watch students struggle with problems he could solve in his sleep, and pretend to be invisible. But invisibility had its advantages. Teachers spoke freely in front of him. Students ignored him completely. He'd heard every mathematical conversation, every breakthrough, every frustration. He'd become a silent observer of mathematical education, and what he'd observed had given him insights that no university professor possessed. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain, or even the social isolation. The hardest part was watching brilliant young minds get discouraged by poor teaching methods, seeing students give up on mathematics because nobody had shown them its beauty. Thomas wanted to help, wanted to share what he knew, but who would listen to a disabled janitor? So he developed a different strategy. He would position himself to overhear the most challenging problems. He would think through solutions while he worked. And in his small apartment each night, he would fill notebook after notebook with elegant proofs, revolutionary approaches, and original theorems that would never see the light of day. That Tuesday morning in room 204, something was different. Professor Johnson seemed more excited than usual, more animated. He was pacing back and forth, marker in hand, building up to something important. "Class, I've been contacted by a colleague at MIT. They're working on a new approach to the Riemann hypothesis, and they're looking for fresh perspectives. Anyone who can provide meaningful insight into this problem will receive a full scholarship to MIT's graduate mathematics program." The room fell silent. Even Sarah Chen, usually quick with questions, seemed stunned by the magnitude of what Professor Johnson was suggesting. "I know it sounds impossible," Johnson continued, "but sometimes the best insights come from unexpected places. I'm going to leave this problem on the board all week. Anyone, and I mean anyone who thinks they can contribute, should feel free to try." Thomas felt his heart racing. This was it. This was his chance. But as he looked around the room at the students, at their expensive clothes and confident expressions, at their futures spread out before them like red carpets, he felt the familiar weight of self-doubt. Who was he to think he could solve what MIT professors couldn't? Who was he to imagine that his years of silent work had value? He was just a janitor, a broken man with a mop bucket and impossible dreams. As Thomas reached for his cleaning supplies to leave the room, Sarah Chen whispered to her friend Jessica, loud enough for him to hear, "Watch this. This is going to be hilarious." She had no idea she was about to witness mathematical history. "Excuse me, Professor Johnson." Thomas's voice was quiet, slurred, barely audible over the rustle of students packing their bags. The classroom fell silent. Every head turned. Professor Johnson looked up from his papers, surprise evident on his face. In 5 years of teaching at Lincoln High, the janitor had never spoken to him directly. "Yes, Thomas? Do you need something?" Thomas felt 30 pairs of eyes on him. His left hand trembled slightly as he gripped his mop handle for support. "The problem on the board. May I try?" The silence stretched for 5 long seconds. Then Jake Morrison let out a snort of laughter. "This is Rich. The janitor wants to solve $1 million math problem." "Jake, be respectful," Professor Johnson said automatically, but his tone suggested he found the situation amusing rather than offensive. Thomas, I appreciate your interest, but this is a graduate-level problem. It requires years of advanced mathematical training. I understand, Thomas replied, his words careful and measured. But you said anyone could try. Sarah Chen pulled out her phone, already filming. This would make great content for social media. The disabled janitor who thought he was a mathematician. Her followers would love it. Professor Johnson looked at the clock. Class was over, but several students had lingered to watch the spectacle. Well, I suppose there's no harm in it. Go ahead, Thomas. Give it your best shot. Thomas approached the board slowly, his uneven gait more pronounced under the pressure of being watched. He set down his mop bucket and reached for a marker with his right hand. His fingers shook slightly as he uncapped it. The Riemann hypothesis filled half the board in Professor Johnson's neat handwriting. Complex equations, Greek letters, subscripts and superscripts that looked like a foreign language to most people. Thomas studied it for a moment, then began to write. His first few lines looked wrong. The approach seemed elementary, almost naive. Professor Johnson frowned, leaning forward to see better. Several students exchanged glances and stifled giggles. Is he trying to use basic number theory? Sarah whispered to Jessica, loud enough for others to hear. This is embarrassing. But Thomas wasn't deterred. He continued writing, his marker moving steadily across the board. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his battered notebook. What's that? Professor Johnson asked, his amusement fading to curiosity. Thomas opened the notebook to a page near the middle. The paper was yellow with age, covered in dense mathematical notation. My work, he said simply. 20 years of work. He began copying from the notebook, translating his handwritten equations to the board. As he wrote, something remarkable became apparent. This wasn't random scribbling or wishful thinking. This was sophisticated mathematics, advanced, original. The students stopped laughing. Professor Johnson stepped closer, his expression shifting from amused tolerance to genuine interest. The equations Thomas was writing built upon each other in logical progression, each step following naturally from the one before. Where did you learn this approach? Johnson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas paused in his writing. I developed it, in my apartment, at night, when I couldn't sleep. He flipped to another page in his notebook, then another. Hundreds of pages filled with mathematical explorations, each more complex than the last. 20 years of solitary genius, hidden in a janitor's pocket. Thomas, Professor Johnson said slowly, what did you do before you worked here? The marker stopped moving. Thomas turned to face the class, his weathered face showing a mixture of pain and pride. I was a professor, Caltech, until the accident. The room was dead silent now. Sarah Chen had stopped filming, her phone forgotten in her hand. Jake Morrison's cocky smirk had vanished completely. Thomas turned back to the board and continued writing. His approach to the Riemann hypothesis wasn't in any textbook because he'd invented it himself. Years of thinking, years of exploring mathematical landscapes that existed only in his mind, had led him to insights that no university professor possessed. But then, Professor Johnson saw something that made his blood run cold. The approach Thomas was using, the elegant way he was connecting number theory to complex analysis, it wasn't from any textbook. This was completely original. And if Johnson was reading it correctly, if Thomas was going where Johnson thought he was going, then this broken man with a mop bucket was about to accomplish something that had eluded mathematicians for over a century. The only sound in room 204 was the soft squeak of marker against whiteboard. Thomas had filled 2 complete boards with equations, his handwriting flowing in perfect mathematical script that seemed impossible given the tremor in his hands. But when Thomas held a marker to solve mathematics, the tremor disappeared. It was as if his disability recognized the sanctity of the moment and stepped aside. Sarah Chen could smell her own nervous sweat mixing with the sharp odor of dry erase markers and the lingering scent of industrial floor cleaner from Thomas's mop bucket. The familiar classroom smells had taken on an almost electric quality, as if the air itself was charged with the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Professor Johnson stood 3 feet behind Thomas, close enough to see every symbol, every calculation, every breathtaking logical leap. His mouth had gone completely dry. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated his tongue as he realized what Thomas was doing. This wasn't just solving the Riemann hypothesis. This was reinventing how mathematicians thought about prime numbers entirely. "Thomas," Johnson whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief, "where did you learn to connect zeta functions to prime distribution like this?" Thomas didn't stop writing. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, but his voice remained steady. "I didn't learn it. I discovered it. 19 years, 4 months, 6 days ago. I was lying in bed, thinking about why prime numbers seem random but aren't. The pattern was there all along. We just weren't looking at it correctly." The marker squeaked against the board as Thomas drew a complex diagram showing the relationship between prime numbers and zeros of the zeta function. It looked like a musical staff made of mathematics, elegant and beautiful, and completely original. Jake Morrison found himself leaning forward despite his embarrassment at having mocked Thomas earlier. The quarterback's brain wasn't wired for advanced mathematics, but even he could sense they were watching something historic unfold. The room felt sacred, like a church during midnight mass. "I need to make a phone call," Professor Johnson said suddenly, pulling out his cell phone. "Thomas, please don't stop. Keep going." "Who are you calling?" Sarah asked, her earlier mockery replaced by genuine awe. "MIT. My colleague needs to see this immediately." As Johnson dialed, Thomas continued his work on the third board. The equations were becoming increasingly complex, but also increasingly beautiful. Mathematics at its highest level has an aesthetic quality that transcends logic, and Thomas was creating art disguised as proof. The numbers he'd been whispering while cleaning suddenly made sense. They weren't random. They were pieces of this solution, fragments of genius that Thomas had been assembling in his mind for 2 decades while the world ignored him. His bent notebook fell open on the floor, revealing page after page of preparatory work. Explorations, dead ends, breakthroughs. The mathematical equivalent of 20 years of diary entries, chronicling a brilliant mind's solitary journey through abstract landscapes. "Dr. Chen?" "This is Richard Johnson at Lincoln High School in Sacramento. Yes, I know it's early. I need you to drop everything and get on a video call. Now. I have someone here who's about to solve the Riemann hypothesis using an approach that's going to revolutionize number theory." The students exchanged glances. Dr. Chen at MIT? Sarah Chen wondered if she was related to the famous mathematician. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his trembling left hand, leaving a small smudge on his forehead. His concentration was absolute. 20 years of solitary thinking had led to this moment, and he could feel the solution crystallizing on the board like mathematical poetry. "I can see it," whispered Jessica Martinez, Sarah's best friend, who was struggling with basic algebra. "I can't understand it, but I can see it. It's beautiful." That's when Thomas did something unexpected. He stopped writing and turned to face the class. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in years. "You want to know something funny?" he said, his slurred speech somehow sounding clearer than it had in decades. The hardest part wasn't solving the problem. The hardest part was believing I was smart enough to try. He turned back to the board and wrote the final line of his proof. 27 symbols that represented the culmination of human mathematical understanding, written by a man the world had dismissed as broken. As Thomas wrote the last symbol, Professor Johnson looked up from his phone call with an expression of pure wonder. "Thomas, Dr. Chen wants to know how long this took you to develop." Thomas set down the marker and picked up his mop handle, suddenly looking like a janitor again. But something had changed in his posture, in the way he carried himself. He looked like a man who had just remembered who he really was. 20 years, 4 months, and about 37 seconds. As Thomas wrote the final line, Professor Johnson pulled out his phone again. Not to record the mathematics, but to call MIT. Because what Thomas had just done, what this broken man with a mop bucket had just accomplished, was going to change mathematics forever. 3 weeks later, the video had 47 million views. Sarah Chen had posted her phone recording to TikTok with the caption, "Janitor solves impossible math problem." Within hours, it had been shared by mathematics professors, students, and people who couldn't solve basic algebra but recognized genius when they saw it. The Clay Mathematics Institute confirmed it first. Thomas Martinez had indeed solved the Riemann hypothesis. The proof was elegant, original, and completely correct. The $1 million prize was his, along with something far more valuable: recognition. But Thomas still showed up to work every morning at 6 a.m. He still pushed his mop bucket down the hallways of Lincoln High School. The difference was, now students stopped him in the halls. "Mr. Martinez, could you help me understand logarithms? Thomas, I'm struggling with calculus. Do you have a minute?" "Professor Martinez," because that's what they called him now, "could you explain how you visualize complex numbers?" Professor Johnson had offered to help Thomas transition back into academic life. Universities were calling daily, offering positions, research opportunities, speaking engagements. But Thomas wasn't ready. Not yet. "I've been invisible for 20 years, he told Johnson one afternoon as they shared coffee in the teacher's lounge. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. I need time to remember who I am." The hardest call had been to Rebecca, his former fiancée. She'd seen the video, of course. Everyone had seen the video. She'd reached out through social media, tentatively at first, then with growing emotion. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have seen." "You saw a broken man," Thomas had replied, his speech clearer now, strengthened by confidence. "You weren't wrong. I was broken, but broken doesn't mean worthless." They'd met for coffee the following week. Rebecca was married now, with 2 children, but she needed to say what she'd been carrying for 20 years. "I loved the professor you were. I should have loved the man you became." Thomas had smiled, the same small smile he'd shown his students the day everything changed. "I'm both now. Finally." The Clay Institute ceremony was held at MIT 3 months after the video went viral. Thomas walked across the stage without his mop bucket for the first time in 2 decades, wearing a rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit. When they handed him the check for $1 million, he thought about his small apartment, his 20 years of solitude, his notebooks full of discoveries that had never seen light. But when the reporter asked him what he planned to do with the money, Thomas's answer surprised everyone. "I'm starting a foundation for students who don't fit the traditional mold, kids who think differently, learn differently, dream differently, because genius doesn't always look like what we expect." Sarah Chen was in the audience that night. She'd flown to Boston on her own, using money from her part-time job, because she needed to apologize in person. Afterward, she approached Thomas with tears in her eyes. "I almost didn't film it," she confessed. "I was going to make fun of you. I'm so ashamed." Thomas looked at this brilliant young woman who'd grown up in a world that valued quick judgments and social media moments, and he felt not anger, but understanding. "Sarah, you gave me the greatest gift possible," he said. "You gave me witnesses. Without your video, this moment might have happened in an empty classroom with no one to see. Thank you for helping me become visible again." The video title had been changed months ago, once people understood what they were really watching. It now read, "Former professor solves 160-year-old math problem, a story of resilience and hidden genius." But Thomas preferred the comments section, where thousands of people shared their own stories of feeling invisible, of being underestimated, of having talents the world couldn't see. Teachers wrote about students they'd dismissed. Employers wrote about workers they'd overlooked. Children wrote about feeling different and finding hope in Thomas's story. The comment that moved him most came from a 15-year-old girl with autism. "Mr. Martinez, because of you, I joined the math team at my school. My teacher says I think about numbers differently than other kids, but now I know that's not wrong. It's just different. Thank you for showing me that different can be genius too." 6 months after the video, Thomas made his decision. He would return to teaching, but not at a university. He wanted to work with students who'd been written off, kids who didn't fit traditional models of intelligence. Lincoln High School created a new position for him, Director of Alternative Mathematical Learning. His first class had 12 students, kids with learning disabilities, students who'd failed traditional math courses, young people who'd been told they weren't math people. Thomas looked at their faces on that first day and saw himself 20 years ago, broken but not beaten, different but not diminished. "Everyone in this room has been told they can't do something," Thomas said, standing at the front of the classroom where he'd once mopped floors. "I'm here to tell you that the people who said that were wrong. Intelligence isn't about the body you're born with or the way your brain processes information. It's about the curiosity you choose to feed and the problems you refuse to give up on." He picked up a marker and began writing on the board, his handwriting still perfect, despite the tremor in his left hand. "Today, we're going to start with something simple. We're going to prove that every single person in this room is capable of mathematical thinking. And then, we're going to change the world." Outside the classroom window, Thomas could see his old mop bucket in the janitor's closet. He'd kept it as a reminder of where he'd been, but more importantly, as proof that every ending can be a new beginning. The next time you see someone different, someone the world has overlooked or dismissed, remember Thomas Martinez. Remember that genius doesn't always announce itself with credentials and confidence. Sometimes it whispers numbers while mopping floors, carries dreams in battered notebooks, and waits 20 years for someone brave enough to ask, "What if we're wrong about this person?" You might be looking at the next person who changes the world. They just haven't had their 37 seconds yet.